Having explored the ideas of the early socialists, we now turn to the 19th century's most influential socialist thinker, Karl Marx. Unlike earlier reformers, Marx argued that communism was not a utopian vision based on hopes for a better society. He believed social change could not be achieved through good intentions or moral appeals alone. Marx insisted that his ideas were scientific rather than utopian. By studying history and economics, he believed he had uncovered the laws of social development. In his view, societies changed in predictable ways through economic forces and class conflict. Rather than imagining an ideal future, Marx claimed to be explaining the course history was already taking. To Marx, communism was not just a desirable goal, but the inevitable next stage of history. He argued that, just as earlier societies had evolved from one system to another, capitalism would eventually give way to communism. His work sought to explain why this transformation would occur and what role workers would play in bringing it about. Marx's first evidence came not from abstract theory, but from the world around him. As the Industrial Revolution transformed Europe in the 1830s and 1840s, factories came to dominate economic life. Observing this new industrial system, Marx became convinced that capitalism contained a deep and fundamental injustice. Marx observed that factory workers labored long hours and produced enormous wealth, yet received only a small share of its value. Many lived in poverty, while factory owners grew increasingly rich and powerful. To Marx, this stark contrast showed that capitalism was fundamentally unequal. In developing his argument, Marx agreed with Adam Smith that labor creates value. But he took this idea further, asking, if workers are the source of value, why do they receive only a fraction of the wealth they create? His answer was that workers were being exploited. Because capitalists owned the means of production, they controlled production and kept most of the profits, while workers received only a portion of the value they created. Marx argued that this extraction of surplus value from workers' labor was the central injustice of capitalism. Marx believed that this exploitation stemmed from control of the means of production, the factories, machines, land, tools, and raw materials used to produce goods. In capitalist societies, these resources were owned by a small class of capitalists, or bourgeoisie, rather than by the workers whose labor created wealth. According to Marx, ownership of the means of production gave capitalists more than economic power. It also gave them influence over society's major institutions. He argued that governments, laws, schools, religious organizations, and cultural values often reflected the interests of the wealthy and helped preserve the existing social order and protect private property. As a result, Marx believed that workers were conditioned to accept their position rather than challenge it. Schools, governments, and cultural values reinforced obedience and respect for existing authority, helping to sustain capitalism by discouraging workers from recognizing their exploitation. For Marx, the struggle between workers and capitalists extended far beyond the factory floor. It shaped politics, religion, education, and culture, all of which he believed helped maintain a system that benefited those who owned the means of production while keeping workers dependent on them. Marx's criticism of capitalism extended to religion as well. He famously described religion as the opiate of the masses, a phrase often misunderstood. Marx was not simply attacking religion. Rather, he argued that it helped people cope with suffering while also encouraging them to accept the social conditions that caused it. In his view, religion played a role in sustaining the existing social order within capitalist society. Marx argued that many religious teachings encouraged people to accept suffering and social inequality as part of life. Workers were often taught to endure hardship patiently and focus on rewards in the afterlife rather than seeking change in the present. According to Marx, these beliefs made people less likely to challenge the conditions that kept them poor and powerless. In Marx's view, religion provided comfort to people facing hardship, much like a painkiller eases physical suffering. However, he believed this comfort came at a cost. By encouraging people to focus on rewards in the afterlife, religion could discourage them from challenging injustice in the present. Instead of seeking social change, workers might come to accept poverty and inequality as inevitable or divinely ordained. For this reason, Marx believed religion helped sustain capitalism. By comforting the working class and encouraging acceptance of existing conditions, it reduced the likelihood of resistance. Thus, when Marx called religion the opiate of the masses, he meant that it dulled awareness of social injustice and made it easier for capitalists to maintain their power. Marx believed that workers often placed their loyalty in the wrong institutions. Many identified strongly with their nation, government, or religious community, but Marx argued that these institutions largely served the interests of the ruling class rather than those of ordinary workers. Instead, Marx argued that workers should see themselves first and foremost as members of the proletariat, or working class. Their primary loyalty should be to fellow workers who shared the same economic interests and struggles. Because exploitation existed across national borders, Marx believed workers everywhere should unite in a common cause, a view captured in his famous slogan, "Workers of the world, unite." Marx also argued that workers should focus on improving their material conditions rather than placing their faith in governments, nationalist movements, or religious institutions. Because he viewed these institutions as serving the interests of the capitalist class, he believed that meaningful change could come only through the collective action of workers themselves. This emphasis on shared economic interests became the foundation of class consciousness, the awareness that workers shared a common struggle against exploitation. Marx believed that once workers developed this awareness, they would organize, challenge the existing social order, and work together to create a new society. As a result, class consciousness became a central concept in Marxist thought and a major influence on later labor and socialist movements. Marx's understanding of history provided a second foundation for his theory. It was shaped not only by what he observed during the Industrial Revolution, but also by the ideas of the German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel. Hegel argued that history advanced through a process of conflict and change, known as the dialectic. According to Hegel, every historical situation or thesis eventually generates its opposite, the antithesis. The conflict between these opposing forces produces a synthesis, a new situation that resolves some tensions while creating new ones. This process then repeats, driving history forward through continual change and conflict. A historical example can be seen in the French Revolution. The revolution challenged the old monarchical and aristocratic order, while the violence and instability that followed represented a reaction against it. Out of this conflict emerged a new political system that sought greater stability. For Hegel, such struggles showed that history advanced through the clash of opposing forces, with each conflict producing a new stage of development. Marx accepted Hegel's idea that conflict drives historical change, but he disagreed about its source. While Hegel believed history was shaped primarily by ideas and beliefs, Marx argued that economic conditions and material interests were the true forces behind historical development. As a materialist, Marx saw class conflict, not competing philosophies, as the engine of history. In Marx's view, people do not usually struggle because they hold different philosophical beliefs. Instead, they fight over tangible issues such as wealth, resources, political power, and control of the means of production. As a result, Marx argued that the major conflicts of history were not clashes of ideas, but struggles between social classes with competing economic interests. By applying Hegel's dialectic to economics, Marx developed dialectical materialism. He argued that every economic system contains contradictions that lead to conflict and change. Under capitalism, this conflict took the form of a struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Marx believed that as these tensions grew, capitalism would be replaced by socialism and eventually by communism. In this way, Marx adapted Hegel's dialectic to economics. Rather than seeing history as driven by ideas or spiritual forces, he argued that economic conditions and class conflict were the true engines of historical change. This concept became a central pillar of Marxist thought and shaped his interpretation of the past, present, and future. Marx believed that all of human history could be understood as a series of class struggles. He argued that every economic system contained tensions that eventually led to conflict and change. As one class challenged another, old social and economic systems were replaced by new ones. History, therefore, followed a pattern driven by class conflict and competing economic interests. According to Marx, history began with primitive communal societies in which land and resources were held collectively and class divisions were minimal. Because there was little private property, there was also little conflict between economic classes. Marx viewed this stage as the earliest form of human society and the starting point in the historical development of class struggle. Over time, stronger groups gained control of land and resources, leading to the rise of feudalism. In medieval Europe, kings and nobles owned most of the land, while peasants worked it as serfs. Society became divided between landowners and labourers, creating new class tensions. Marx saw feudalism as a stage marked by conflict between these groups, a conflict that would eventually contribute to the system's downfall. As trade expanded and towns grew, a new middle class, the bourgeoisie of merchants, artisans, and business owners, emerged. Their rise weakened feudalism and created a new social order, which soon became the next stage in history's cycle of class conflict. Eventually, the bourgeoisie overthrew the traditional aristocracy, a shift Marx associated with events such as England's Glorious Revolution and the French Revolution. The result was capitalism, a system based on private property and industrial production. While capitalism generated great wealth and innovation, Marx argued that it primarily benefited the bourgeoisie, who owned the means of production. Yet capitalism also created the force that would challenge it, the proletariat, or working class. As industrialization expanded, workers became increasingly dependent on wages. Marx believed they would develop class consciousness, recognize their shared interests, and unite against the bourgeoisie, creating the next major conflict in the historical process. Marx predicted that this conflict would eventually lead to a proletarian revolution. Workers would overthrow capitalism, abolish private ownership of the means of production, and establish communism, a classless society in which wealth and resources were collectively shared. For Marx, communism was the final stage of history. Once social classes disappeared, class conflict would end as well. In his view, communism would create a classless, equal society and bring the historical struggle between competing classes to a close. Marx's third major source of evidence came from history itself, especially the French Revolution. He saw the revolution as proof that societies change through class conflict. In his view, the struggle between social classes, not ideas alone, was the force that drove revolutionary change and transformed one economic system into another. To Marx, the French Revolution was not primarily a struggle over ideals such as liberty or democracy. Instead, he saw it as a conflict between social classes, with the rising bourgeoisie challenging the power of the aristocracy and monarchy. Their victory, he argued, demonstrated how class conflict could overturn an existing social order and create a new one. Marx saw similar patterns in other revolutions. He pointed to England's Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the French Revolution of 1789 as examples of rising social classes overthrowing established ruling elites. To Marx, these events demonstrated that history advances through struggles between competing classes, with each victory creating a new social and economic order. From these examples, Marx drew a bold conclusion. If the bourgeoisie had overthrown the feudal aristocracy, then the proletariat would eventually overthrow the bourgeoisie. Just as earlier revolutions had replaced one ruling class with another, Marx believed a future revolution would replace capitalism with a new social and economic system.